So I want you to picture this. For everyone listening right now, just take yourself back to 2007.
Oh boy. The golden era.
Right. The global economy is just, cruising along at like 100 miles an hour.
Hmm.
If you looked at the standard dashboard that literally every politician, every CEO, every news anchor obsesses over, it looked like an absolute golden age.
I mean, on paper, it was perfect.
Exactly. Gross domestic product was soaring. Unemployment was, remarkably low. Corporate profits were just breaking historical records left and right.
We were all staring at the scoreboard, basically convinced we were winning the game.
Yeah, completely convinced. And then 18 months later, the entire engine just exploded. Entire banking systems evaporated. Literally trillions of dollars of wealth just vanished, and millions of people lost their homes.
It was catastrophic.
And so you have to ask why?
Yeah.
How did we miss it? And the answer is because that standard dashboard we all rely on is completely broken. We were obsessively measuring the speed of the car, right?
Okay.
But we were entirely ignoring the structural rot in the axles.
Which is honestly a profound and terrifying blind spot in modern society. We are just exceptionally good at counting these surface-level artifacts of an economy.
The surface stuff, yeah. Like dollars exchanged.
Right. Dollars exchanged, widgets produced, hours billed. But we are shockingly inept at measuring the structural health of the underlying systems that actually produce those artifacts. We just continually mistake the temporary accounting of resources for the actual permanent vitality of a nation.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. For you listening, the ultimate learner, the person who actually wants to know how the machinery of the world really operates, we're throwing out the standard dashboard today.
We have to.
Yeah, we have to. We have a stack of sources today centered around this fascinating, dense 2025 paper by George James Dukas. And the title alone is, well, it's a mouthful. It's called Macroeconomic Structural Operator System, Transdimensional Unified Field Theory.
I know the terminology sounds like quantum physics or something.
It really does.
But the ambition of the paper is incredibly grounded. Basically, Dukas is arguing that an economy can have abundant labor, mountains of capital, cutting-edge technology, and vast natural resources, but it can still completely collapse if all those assets are blocked by institutional friction or, destabilizing drag.
So it's not about throwing out standard economics altogether then?
No, not at all. This isn't about discarding traditional economics. It's more of a systems-level complement. It's focused exclusively on productive capacity.
Okay, so the actual, physical and institutional capability of a system to convert raw inputs into real, durable wealth.
Exactly. That is the core of it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because where do we even begin with a paper that claims to unify macroeconomic theory across multiple dimensions? I mean, the transdimensional part of the title caught my eye immediately. Are we talking about the multiverse here?
No, not quite the multiverse. In this specific context, transdimensional basically refers to scale invariance.
Scale invariance, okay.
Right. Dukas posits that the mathematical laws governing the creation or the destruction of wealth, they apply equally across all dimensions of human organization.
Wait, really? So big and small?
Exactly. The exact same structural forces that dictate the rise and fall of a $3 trillion national economy, they apply to the supply chain of a mid-sized corporation and, remarkably, to the personal financial stability of a single household. The physics of prosperity don't change just because the scale changes.
Okay, that is a massive claim. I mean, to say my household budget runs on the same physics as the U.S. economy.
It is bold, but he backs it up.
So to prove it, Dukas centers this entire unified theory on a single operator equation. Now, for you listening, don't worry. We aren't going to turn this into a dry calculus lecture, but we really have to look under the hood of this equation because the conceptual shift is just staggering.
It really redefines everything.
So the formula calculates Y star sub T, which represents structural productive capacity. And it's driven by four main variables represented by Greek letters. First up, we have phi. This is the fuel and the engine power. The paper calls it productive expansion.
Right. Think of phi as the raw forward thrust of the system. So it encompasses things like durable private investment, useful technological innovation, and genuine labor force participation.
Basically, the active formation of new capability.
Yes, exactly.
Then we have psi. And psi is the brakes, or the heavy cargo pulling the car backward. The paper terms this contractionary drag.
So this is the pressure acting against the engine. It includes things like inflation volatility, restrictive financial conditions, overwhelming debt service burdens. Basically, it's the energy the system expends just trying to hold itself together under stress.
Okay, engine and brakes. Got it. Next is R, and this is the sludge in the gears, the potholes on the road, the rusted axle. The technical term is cumulative damping, but I think we can just call it friction.
Friction is the perfect word for it. It's the administrative complexity, permitting delays, obsolete infrastructure, fragmented supply chains. R represents the inefficiency of the conversion process itself.
Right, the stuff that slows everything down. And finally, we have L, a permanent engine upgrade, a persistent lift. So a systemic reform or a new general-purpose technology that just permanently alters the capabilities of the machine.
That's the holy grail, the L lift.
Okay, so we have phi for the engine, psi for the brakes, R for friction, and L for the upgrade. Now, I have to push back here gently. I mean, isn't this just a really fancy, highly academic way of saying good things minus bad things equals growth? We all know investment is good and debt is bad.
Yeah.
Why do we need a whole unified field theory to tell us to build factories and cut red tape?
Well, what's fascinating here is the specific mathematical architecture Dukas uses. He explicitly designs this as a multiplicative operator, not an additive one. Right. And that distinction changes our entire understanding of policy and business strategy. In standard, additive thinking, if you have 10 units of positive investment and 2 units of bad regulatory friction, you just assume you subtract 2 from 10, leaving you with 8 units of net growth.
Right. The additive mindset basically says you can always just outspend or outwork your structural problems. You just slam on the gas pedal harder to overcome the sludge in the engine.
Precisely. And that is the illusion. Because the equation is multiplicative, and because friction, that R variable, sits in the denominator of the fraction, a tiny amount of structural friction can completely neutralize a massive amount of investment.
Wait. Break that down for a second.
Okay, imagine you pour $50 billion into modernizing a national energy grid. That is a massive surge in your engine power. But if your permitting processes are labyrinthine and local jurisdictions are constantly suing each other, meaning your R is exceptionally high, that denominator shrinks the entire outcome.
Oh, wow.
The mathematical reality is that you simply cannot outinvest a broken system. The friction literally divides your capital into nothingness.
The denominator eats the numerator.
Exactly.
That completely explains why we see these massive government spending bills or, massive corporate IT budgets that result in absolutely zero noticeable improvement. The money was spent, the fee was injected, but the output doesn't change.
Because output alone cannot identify latent capacity. A high expansion combined with high friction looks mathematically identical on a GDP spreadsheet to low expansion with low friction.
So they might both yield like a sluggish 2% growth rate.
Yes, but structurally they are entirely different beasts. The first one is a massively inefficient engine running at 10,000 RPMs just to move an inch. It's burning enormous amounts of fuel simply to overcome its own internal sludge. Traditional GDP metrics hide that structural rot right up until the engine finally seizes.
Man, it's like the difference between cruising effortlessly at 50 miles an hour in fifth gear versus redlining at 50 miles an hour in first gear with the parking brake fully engaged.
That is a perfect analogy.
They both register as 50 on the speedometer, but that second car is actively destroying itself.
Yeah.
So, okay. If we understand that we're dealing with a multiplicative system, we need to dive into the specific variables, like what actually constitutes real engine power versus fake speed. Let's zoom in on phi, the engine, and psi, the brakes.
Okay, so the central differentiation the text makes regarding phi is the absolute separation of what it calls temporary acceleration from high-quality phi flows. Because, frankly, we have a terrible habit of confusing a sugar rush with genuine muscle growth.
A sugar rush. I see this constantly in financial media. So everyone listening, think about the difference between a temporary surge in consumer demand versus durable capacity building. Like, imagine the government hands out massive stimulus checks and millions of people rush out to buy imported televisions on credit cards.
Right, retail sales skyrocket.
Yeah, GDP jumps for 2 quarters. Politicians take a massive victory lap. But what actually happened to the productive capacity of the country? Nothing.
Nothing at all. The headline demand surge outpaced the underlying supply capacity. The system was temporarily forced to run hotter, but it didn't actually learn how to produce more efficiently. The result of that kind of low-quality phi flow isn't a durable gain in living standards. It inevitably mutates into inflation, higher trade deficits, or just increased financial fragility.
So what does a real high-quality phi flow look like? Give me a tangible example.
A high-quality flow actively lowers the real costs of production for the future. So imagine a mid-sized manufacturing company investing $5 million to adopt advanced digital robotics. Or, say, a national initiative that successfully retrains fossil fuel workers to maintain advanced nuclear reactors.
Okay, I see.
These actions expand the literal boundaries of what the system is capable of producing tomorrow. They don't just pull future consumption forward. They permanently widen the channel of output.
Got it. And what about psi, the contractionary drag? I mean, we usually think of economic drag as the ultimate enemy. If phi is the hero building capacity, psi must be the villain destroying it.
Right. It's really tempting to view it as a binary battle between good and evil, yeah. But the paper makes this counterintuitive, frankly brilliant point. Not all drag is bad.
Wait, really?
Yeah, a system with zero drag is a system completely out of control. Dukas explicitly states that certain forms of psi are absolutely necessary mechanisms of adjustment and stabilization.
I hear you. But if taxes and regulations create drag, wouldn't an economy with zero taxes and zero rules mathematically have zero drag and therefore infinite growth? The math kind of seems to suggest we should just eliminate all restraints.
But that assumes the restraints serve no stabilizing function, which is a fatal misreading of system dynamics. Think about the Volcker shock in the early 1980s.
Oh, right, with the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. The U.S. economy was suffering from chronic, destabilizing inflation. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker drastically raised interest rates. That monetary tightening was a massive, deliberate injection of side drag. It choked off borrowing, caused a severe recession, bankrupted businesses.
And intentionally slammed on the brakes.
He did. But if a car is careening toward a cliff because the accelerator is stuck, slamming on the brakes is literally the only way to save the vehicle. Unstable inflation destroys the price signaling mechanism of a free market. It makes long-term investment impossible. The drag Volcker introduced was proportionate and necessary to preserve the long-term productive capacity of the system.
It's like gravity. You don't want a car with zero weight or zero friction against the road because the slightest bump would send it flying into the atmosphere. You need gravity to maintain traction.
Exactly. And the text applies this to taxation and regulation as well. Taxes are absolutely a form of drag on private capital. But if those taxes finance the public goods, the independent judiciary, and the physical infrastructure that allow markets to exist in the first place, then that drag is a necessary stabilizing force.
Right.
Safety standards, capital requirements for banks, environmental protections, these all impose a side cost. But they protect the system from catastrophic, irreversible failures.
So the goal isn't just deregulation for the sake of deregulation.
No, not at all. The structural aim is to ensure that the restraints are proportionate, predictable, and most importantly, that they don't permanently scar the system's capacity to regenerate.
To bring this right down to the ground for you listening,
Yeah.
think about how this framework instantly clarifies corporate behavior. Imagine your company's CEO borrows $50 million. If they use that debt to execute a massive stock buyback, it pushes up the share price, creates headline financial demand. The dashboard looks great.
Looks fantastic on paper.
Right. But if they borrow that exact same $50 million to invest in a proprietary software platform that cuts your team's processing time in half, the structural reality of those two choices is vastly different. One creates actual flow, real productive capacity. The other is pure financial engineering that temporarily juices the numbers, but eventually morphs into side drag when the heavy debt service comes due.
It just forces the listener to look past the dollar amount and ask the structural question, does this activity expand underlying capability, or does it merely extract present value while introducing future fragility?
Okay, so we've established the engine, phi, and the necessary brakes, psi. But what happens when the road itself is actively destroying the car? We have to move from psi, which is pressure, to R, which is friction. This brings us to section 3 of our deep dive, the hidden killer of cumulative damping. This is a crucial section. This section of the paper absolutely blew my mind because it perfectly describes why so many modern projects feel like wading through wet cement.
Friction is perhaps the most insidious threat to an advanced economy because it is largely invisible. We notice a massive new factory being built. We notice interest rates spiking. We rarely notice the administrative sludge in the gears until the entire machine just grinds to an inexplicable halt.
And Dukas gets incredibly specific about the math of this sludge. He doesn't just use R as some vague placeholder for bureaucracy. He represents R, this cumulative damping, with a giant Greek pi symbol, which denotes a product sequence. The formula is R sub T equals the product sequence of 1 plus R sub I. Now, for those of us who haven't taken a math class recently, what does that product symbol actually mean in reality?
It means that sequential delays and frictions do not simply add up, they compound multiplicatively.
Okay, give me an example.
So if you have a process with 5 distinct regulatory hurdles, you don't just add the delay of hurdle A to hurdle B. The friction of hurdle A alters the baseline conditions, making the friction of hurdle B exponentially worse.
Let's use a specific high-stakes scenario. Let's say a company is trying to build a new semiconductor manufacturing plant. It's a critical, multi-billion-dollar FI investment. First, they face a local zoning and permitting delay over water rights. It takes 6 months to resolve. That is friction variable R1.
Right. And in a standard additive model, society looks at that and says, okay, the factory is simply delayed by 6 months, a minor inconvenience for a 30-year asset.
Right. But while they were waiting for those 6 months, the macroeconomic environment shifts. Inflation spikes, and the central bank raises interest rates. Suddenly, the original financing package the company secured is no longer viable because the cost of capital just doubled. The bank wants to renegotiate. That is friction R2.
Notice how the first delay actually created the vulnerability to the second delay. If the permit had cleared immediately, the capital would have been locked in and deployed before the rate hike.
Exactly. And it gets worse. By the time the new financing is secured, another 4 months have passed. Now, the specialized construction crews they had on retainer have taken other contracts in different states.
Oh, of course.
The supply chain for the steel and specialized concrete has shifted. Sourcing new materials and labor adds another year of delay. That's R3. Then they find out the local utility grid has a massive backlog and cannot connect the facility's power substations for 3 years. That's R4.
And this is the devastating reality of the product symbol. The frictions interact, they cascade, and they multiply. Capital sits idle, bleeding interest. Supply chains lose synchronization. Investor confidence evaporates. The model defines this as cumulative structural damping, the literal dissipation of productive potential as resources are forced through these fragmented legal, administrative, and logistical mazes.
Think about this in your own daily life, listener. Think about the last time you tried to get a critical new software tool approved by your corporate IT department.
Everyone's been there.
Right. It took 2 days for IT to review it. Then they kicked it to legal, which took 4 days. Legal sent it to finance, which took a week. You didn't just lose 13 days of productivity. During those 13 days, your team lost the creative momentum of the project, a competitor launched a similar feature, and your budget window closed. The delays compounded to kill the project entirely. That is the physics of R in your daily life.
It fundamentally shifts how we must view institutional design. Because we traditionally think of economic assets as physical things, a deep water port, an oil reserve, a patented microchip. But Dukas argues that high-quality institutions are themselves a primary, measurable economic asset because they actively lower R.
Wait, how can an institution be an asset if it doesn't actually produce anything physical? I mean, a permitting office doesn't build the microchips.
Well, if we connect this to the broader mathematical picture, a competent, unified regulatory institution provides predictable timelines, clear data standards, and transparent digital portals. That institution does not invent a single new technology. It doesn't print any new currency. But by drastically reducing the denominator of the operator equation, it allows all the existing capital, labor, and technology in the economy to convert into useful output years faster.
Oh, I see.
Institutional efficiency multiplies the power of the numerator. Therefore, a highly functioning bureaucracy is quite literally a wealth-generating asset.
Which explains why a country or a state can have the best universities and the best tech sector in the world, but if their housing policy, their environmental review process, and their energy permitting are just a fragmented disaster, their actual structural growth will be anemic. The friction eats the innovation.
Precisely. We often wonder why the incredible technological leaps we see on our screens don't seem to translate into broad-based improvements in physical infrastructure or living standards. It is because the R damping in the physical world has grown so severe that it is neutralizing the phi expansion of the digital world.
Wow. Okay, so if friction is the hidden killer slowly suffocating the system, how do we break out? How do we get a permanent upgrade? How does a society or a company actually level up its baseline capability? That brings us to section 4, real transformation versus the hype cycle, focusing on L, the lifts, and D, scaling.
Moving from phi and r to L is moving from the everyday functioning of an economy to true structural transformation. Most business strategy and economic policy is simply shifting existing resources around within the current boundaries of the system. An L lift permanently expands those boundaries. It redefines what is physically and economically possible.
But the paper is absolutely ruthless about what actually qualifies as a lift. We live in an era where every new app or minor software update is hailed as a paradigm shift. But just because a new technology exists, let's take generative AI or CRISPR biotechnology, that does not automatically mean society has experienced an L lift. I think every venture capitalist on Earth needs to read this specific section. Dukas outlines 3 incredibly strict, unforgiving tests that an innovation must pass to be considered a true lift. Number 1. Persistence.
Right. Persistence demands that the structural effect must outlast the initial investment boom or the media hype cycle. Think back to the dot-com bubble or the massive telecom fiber optic build-out of the late 90s. A temporary surge in construction jobs to build thousands of data centers is not a lift. That is just an input. It's a burst of phi.
Oh, okay.
The true lift is the permanent change in output capability that remains decades after those data centers are built, integrated, and forgotten as novelties.
Okay, test number 2 is diffusion, and this one is the killer for a lot of modern tech.
It really is. The capability must spread beyond the frontier. If a miraculous new artificial intelligence model is developed, but it is effectively only utilized by 5 massive tech monopolies to optimize their internal ad targeting algorithms, it might generate historic private wealth for their shareholders. But it does not alter the underlying productive capacity of the broader nation.
To be a lift, it has to spread.
It has to diffuse. It has to seamlessly integrate into the workflows of middle-market logistics firms, regional healthcare systems, and local agricultural producers.
And test number 3, additionality. Explain this one, because it sounds like basic math, but it's actually a profound critique of modern business models.
Additionality means the innovation must actually raise total aggregate capacity, rather than simply cannibalizing market share from one sector to another.
Give me an example of something that fails the additionality test.
Consider the transition from traditional cable television to streaming services. Streaming was a massive technological shift. It required billions in investment, new software, new hardware. But macroeconomically, did it vastly expand the total amount of human leisure time or the total output of the entertainment sector? Largely, no.
Right, and still just watching TV.
Exactly. It was a more efficient, user-friendly delivery mechanism that violently shifted revenue from one set of corporate incumbents to a new set of digital incumbents. It was a substitution, not an addition. A true lift must produce more total systemic output relative to the combined labor and capital required.
So persistence, diffusion, additionality. For generative AI to be an actual macroeconomic lift, and not just the biggest stock market bubble of our generation, it has to prove it permanently lowers costs, spreads to the plumber and the dentist, and creates entirely new categories of value rather than just automating away copywriters to boost corporate margins.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this raises an important question about the physical mechanisms of how these technologies actually take root. Dukas introduces a vital concept here: complementarity. A new software system, no matter how brilliant, does not operate in a vacuum. A lift never happens in isolation.
Right. AI requires massive amounts of reliable baseload energy. It requires secure, clean data. It requires a workforce that actually possesses the cognitive flexibility to use it. And perhaps most importantly, it requires management structures willing to completely reorganize their traditional workflows around the new tool.
If you lack the complements, you cannot capture the lift. This perfectly explains the historical mystery of why certain nations invent incredible, paradigm-shifting technologies but fail to reap the economic rewards. They possess the isolated invention, but they lack the complementary infrastructure, the adaptable institutions, or the skilled labor to actually diffuse it.
Wait, speaking of spreading the technology, I noticed something when looking at the core Y-star equation. The variable D, which stands for scaling, isn't actually a separate multiplier in that main formula alongside phi, psi, r, and L. Why is D treated differently if scale is so important?
That is a very astute observation of the math. D is not a separate independent variable because it is not an independent source of output. D is the mechanism of enlargement. It is the viral transmission network of the economy.
I love that analogy. Think of it like epidemiology. If a lift is a new beneficial virus, D is the R naught value, the transmission rate. It's how effectively the ecosystem allows the innovation to jump from host to host.
Precisely. Consider a high-tech startup ecosystem in a specific city, like Silicon Valley in the 90s or Shenzhen today. The ecosystem scales, it exhibits high D dynamics because the venture finance networks, the specialized engineering talent pools, the research universities, and the commercial legal infrastructure are all densely packed and mutually reinforcing.
They feed off each other.
Exactly. The scaling mechanism simply enlarges the productive reach of the phi flows and the L lifts. It is the multiplier of the network effect.
Okay, so we have this beautiful, elegant, unified mathematical framework. We have our engine, our brakes, our friction, our upgrades, and our scaling mechanisms. But where does this actually play out in the physical dirt and concrete of the real world? Dukas doesn't just leave this theory floating in an academic whiteboard. Section 5 of our deep dive covers the 3 tiers of the economy.
This is where it gets very tangible.
Yeah, the paper divides the entire U.S. macroeconomy into 3 distinct interacting layers. And I found this fascinating because it completely upends how society, and certainly Wall Street, usually ranks economic importance. Let's start with Tier 1, households. The paper calls this the foundational tier.
This represents a massive departure from standard macroeconomic orthodoxy. Traditional models, and certainly political rhetoric, treat households primarily as consumers.
Just the people buying this stuff.
Right. They are viewed as the passive endpoint of the economy, the entities that purchase and consume the goods that businesses make. But the structural operator framework insists that households are the foundational engine of all productive capacity.
Yes. It's not just about what you buy at the mall. It's about what you provide to the system before you even clock in to work. The paper painstakingly details how physical and mental health, access to reliable childcare, affordable housing proximity, and commute times are not just social issues. They are hard economic variables that directly impact phi.
Let's analyze commuting times as a structural mechanism. If an individual is forced to sit in gridlock traffic for 3 hours a day simply to reach their place of employment, that is not merely a personal inconvenience. Biologically and psychologically, that commute drains their cognitive bandwidth. They arrived at the workplace physically depleted.
Their latent phi, their raw human potential is bleeding out on the highway.
Exactly. If housing costs force the workforce to live 50 miles from the commercial centers, or if a highly skilled parent cannot participate in the labor market because regional childcare is prohibitively expensive, the macroeconomy is actively losing massive amounts of potential phi flow before it ever enters the measured labor pool.
Wow.
In this framework, labor force participation is not just a statistic about individuals' willingness to work. It is a brutal diagnostic metric of whether the foundational tier is healthy enough to allow human beings to connect to productive opportunities.
Which flows perfectly into Tier 2, firms. The paper calls this the conversion tier.
If households are the foundation generating raw human capital and savings, firms are the crucibles of conversion. They take the labor from the households, the capital from the financial markets, the energy from the grid, and they theoretically organize those inputs to create higher value goods and services.
But the paper notes that the key challenge for Tier 2 is the diffusion problem we touched on earlier, the gap between the frontier firms and everyone else. Think about the gap between Amazon's logistics network and a regional department store like Sears over the last 20 years. The technology existed for both of them.
But the structural capacity to absorb and deploy that technology to reorganize workflows, retrain management, and rebuild supply chains was vastly different. Getting innovations out of the R&D lab and into the messy, chaotic day-to-day operations of everyday businesses is the ultimate bottleneck of Tier 2. A local HVAC company adopting AI-driven route optimization is, macroeconomically speaking, just as vital as the tech giant that coded the AI.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Tier 3, infrastructure, the enabling tier. Dukas argues that infrastructure establishes the absolute non-negotiable operating boundaries of the entire system.
It acts as the physical and digital envelope that contains what the households and firms are capable of achieving. You simply cannot operate a 21st century digital firm on a 20th century electrical grid.
Right. I think back to the supply chain crisis during the pandemic. There was a massive backlog at the Port of Los Angeles, dozens of cargo ships just sitting offshore. That isn't just a local California problem. That Tier 3 failure instantly disrupted a Tier 2 manufacturing plant in Ohio that was waiting for microchips, which in turn caused Tier 1 households across the country to lose overtime pay or face inflation for cars.
What is conceptually elegant here is how Tier 3 infrastructure mathematically interacts with the core operator equation.
Hmm.
Infrastructure acts on phi, r, and d simultaneously.
Wait, break that down. How does it hit all three?
Well, take a modernized high-capacity electrical grid, for example. First, its construction is a massive injection of durable private and public investment that boosts phi. Second, a reliable grid drastically reduces the frequency of brownouts, data loss, and supply chain disruptions for all surrounding businesses that lowers R, the friction.
Oh, I see.
And finally, an advanced grid allows a region to support denser, more complex technological ecosystems like data center clusters or advanced manufacturing hubs that raises D, the scaling capability of the region. High-quality infrastructure is a multidimensional catalyst.
Okay, I am intellectually completely on board with this theory. It makes intuitive narrative sense. But I know how academic economics works. It is remarkably easy to invent a beautiful, symmetrical theory with Greek letters on a whiteboard. But Dugas's paper demands rigorous, falsifiable proof. How do we know this transdimensional unified field theory isn't just an elegant philosophical exercise? How do we prove the model actually predicts reality? That brings us to Section 6, the scientific rigor and proving the model.
This is where the paper separates itself from mere theoretical musing and establishes a strict, unforgiving scientific protocol. Appendix B of the text is entirely dedicated to empirical validation, and the cornerstone of that validation is the anti-circularity rule.
I read this part and had to pause because it exposes a flaw in so much of the economic analysis we consume every day. The rule strictly states you cannot use GDP or traditional productivity metrics to measure the structural operators if the entire point of your model is to predict changes in GDP.
It sounds blindingly obvious when stated plainly, but it is a trap that many renowned macroeconomic models fall into. Traditional models often look at total economic output, subtract the contributions of labor and capital, and whatever mysterious growth is left over, they label as technological progress or the solid residual.
Right. Circular logic. It's like saying, I know my new fertilizer works incredibly well. And I ask, how do you know? And you say, because the plants are taller. I ask, but what is the chemical mechanism of the fertilizer? And you reply, the mechanism is that it makes plants taller. You cannot use the final outcome to define the inputs. If you want to claim your structural model predicts economic health, you cannot use economic growth as a data point in your formula for persistent lift. The model would just be predicting itself. So if we are completely forbidden from looking at the final output, if we can't use GDP or revenue, how do we actually measure abstract concepts like cumulative friction, R, or expansion, phi, in the real physical world?
We are forced to construct independent physical indicators from the ground up. The paper provides exhaustive measurement protocols. To measure R, structural friction, we do not look at financial output. We look at the average number of days required to process commercial building permits across 50 municipalities.
Oh, wow. Actual days.
Yes, we look at specific supply chain congestion metrics, like the dwell time of containers at major ports. We measure the total annual hours of infrastructure outages on the national grid. These are independent physical realities of friction.
And for phi, the engine expansion.
We track the real volume of heavy equipment and software investment. We measure prime-age labor force participation rates. We track the physical rate of new business formation, not just LLC registrations, but firms that actually hire a W-2 employee.
The discipline of the model requires you to gather these raw independent metrics, plug them into the phi, psi, r, and l variables of the operator equation, and then subject the model to out-of-sample forecasting tests.
Precisely. Out-of-sample testing is the gold standard of statistical rigor. You build and calibrate your mathematical model using historical data from, say, 2000 to 2015. Then, you lock the model. You do not let the algorithm see the actual economic outcomes of 2016 through 2024. You feed it the raw input variables for those hidden years, and you test whether it can accurately predict the structural shifts that actually occurred.
Dugas calls it disciplined corroboration. It is not enough for the unified field theory to sound theoretically elegant on a deep dive. It must survive hostile forecasting environments against conventional econometric models. It has to prove its utility in messy, chaotic, real-world data.
And it does.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of macro-level theory. We've rebuilt the national economy. But we have to talk about Appendix F. This brings us to Section 7, Scale Invariance and the Anatomy of Personal Bankruptcy. This was, without a doubt, the most profound and deeply human section of the entire document. Dukas takes this massive trans-dimensional macroeconomic equation, the exact same formula used to analyze the semiconductor industry and national electrical grids, and he applies it to the life of a single individual human being.
It is the ultimate demonstration of his scale invariance theory. The structural physics of an economy formation, pressure, resistance, and lift govern the viability of systems regardless of their size. They apply just as mercilessly to a single household struggling to pay the rent as they do to a sovereign nation.
He uses the example of severe personal financial distress, specifically bankruptcy. Usually when society or the banking system looks at a bankrupt person or someone trapped in deep poverty, we use a very simplistic primitive logic. We look at their income, their Y output, and we see it as zero. Therefore, we assume their capability, their phi, must be zero. They have no money, so society implicitly assumes they must have no skills, no drive, or no intrinsic value. Dukas passionately dismantles this assumption using pure mathematics.
He dismantles it because the traditional view fatally conflates the realized outcome with the underlying structural capacity. To understand an individual's struggle, we must revisit the components of the core equation. For a human being, phi productive expansion isn't just a current salary. It encompasses their physical and mental health, their learned skills, their years of work experience, their social networks, and their cognitive resilience.
So a master carpenter who just got laid off because the housing market crashed still has a massive amount of phi. They still have 20 years of physical intuition. They still know how to frame a house perfectly. They still know how to manage a crew.
Yeah.
But their income is zero.
This is where Dukas introduces the critical distinction between latent formation and usable formation. Your accumulated skills, your intelligence, and your experience constitute your latent phi. But whether you can actually deploy that latent capability in the marketplace depends entirely on an accessibility coefficient.
The accessibility coefficient. This is where the macro equation perfectly maps to human psychology and resource management. Imagine that master carpenter has immense skills, high latent phi. But his truck breaks down, and he has no savings to fix it, and his town has zero public transit. Or imagine a skilled nurse who loses stable housing and no longer has a permanent address to put on a job application, or someone who lacks a bank account to receive direct deposits. Suddenly, their accessibility coefficient drops to near zero.
And mathematically, if the accessibility coefficient is zero, your usable phi becomes zero, even though your latent capability or actual human potential remains completely intact and pristine.
It's the exact same math as the billion-dollar semiconductor factory that can't get the water permit. The massive capacity is sitting right there, but the environmental friction makes it entirely useless to the system. So what actually pushes an individual over the edge from struggling into total systemic collapse and bankruptcy? It's not just a lack of usable phi.
No, it is the devastating, vicious cycle created by the interaction of individual pressure, psi, and resistance, R. Just like a national economy facing inflation and debt crises, an individual faces psi pressures. Aggressive debt collection calls, the looming threat of eviction, utility shutoffs, sudden medical emergencies. These are forces creating extreme psychological urgency and destabilization. They are the brakes clamping down on the mind.
And when that unmanageable psi pressure collides with high R resistance,
the human system breaks down. You face the imminent threat of eviction that is massive psi. You urgently need to secure a new job to stop it, but you have no transportation to get to the interview that is R. Furthermore, administrative delays in the state government are holding up your emergency unemployment benefits more R.
The pressure magnifies the resistance. It compounds.
Yes. You can't pay a small municipal parking fine because your funds are frozen. Because you didn't pay the fine, the city suspends your driver's license. Because your license is suspended, you lose your current part-time delivery job. Because you lost the job, you can't pay your rent. The friction compounds multiplicatively that product sequence again, just like the R variable in the macro equation. The individual isn't failing because they lack capability. They're being crushed by the mathematical compounding of structural friction.
This represents a profound diagnostic shift for anyone listening. Think about this carefully. If someone in your family or a junior employee on your team or a friend is deeply struggling, the default societal answer is almost always a lecture on personal responsibility. Get more skills, work harder, take a coding boot camp. We tell them to boost their latent phi. We treat it as a moral failing of effort. But if Dukas's trans-dimensional model is right, the highest leverage intervention might have absolutely nothing to do with their skills or their work ethic.
In many cases of distress, the highest leverage intervention is simply fixing the binding resistance.
Leasing their car.
Precisely. Repairing their car lowers R immediately. Placing a temporary legal stay on aggressive debt collection lowers psi, giving them cognitive breathing room to plan. Providing a reliable childcare voucher lowers R. These targeted interventions do not teach the person a single new skill. They do not change the latent phi by 1 iota.
But they immediately alter the accessibility coefficient. They unlock the massive reservoir of existing usable human capability that was trapped behind a wall of structural friction.
It stabilizes the system so the person's own internal engine can actually drive them forward again. It entirely removes the lens of moral judgment from poverty and failure and replaces it with the objective lens of a structural engineering problem. It replaces moral failing with system diagnostics. It forces us to ask, where is the specific friction preventing this person's inherent capability from converting into durable security?
We have covered an astonishing amount of ground today. We started by shattering the comfortable illusion of GDP as the sole dashboard of our economic reality. We looked under the hood at the true engine of productive expansion, the durable phi flows versus the sugar rush of temporary demand. We examined why certain brakes and restraints, the side drag, are absolutely necessary to prevent the car from flying off the cliff. We uncovered the hidden, multiplicative killer of cumulative damping, the R friction that silently eats our investments. We mapped out how true technological transformation, the L lifts, must pass the unforgiving tests of persistence, diffusion, and additionality. We explored how these forces cascade through the three tiers of our economy, from the foundational households to the converting firms, bounded by the enabling infrastructure. And finally, we saw how this exact same majestic mathematical architecture scales down to explain the daily struggles of a single human being trying to survive a complex world. So what does this all mean?
This raises an important question about our ultimate goals as a civilization. Dukas summarizes the philosophical core of his mathematical unified theory beautifully at the very end of the text. He writes that an economy advances when it does more than simply accumulate resources or accelerate velocity. It truly advances when it actively reduces the waste of human and material potential. The deepest, most vital economic resource we possess isn't a specific piece of software, a new battery technology, or a mountain of financial capital. It is our institutional and physical capacity to coordinate those things, to clear the compounding friction, to contain the destabilizing drag, and to design systems that allow latent human capability to seamlessly connect with opportunity.
And that brings me to a final, provocative thought for you, our listener. We've spent an hour talking about transdimensional macroeconomics. But I want you to take this operator framework and apply it ruthlessly to your own world today. Look at your own life, your own team at work, or your own business. Don't look at it through the standard, flawed dashboard of how much money is in the quarterly budget or how many talented resumes are on your roster. Look at the mechanics. What are the durable phi flows you're actually building versus the temporary hype you're chasing? What necessary psi pressures are keeping your team disciplined versus the unnecessary stress burning them out? But most importantly, what is your invisible R? What is that compounding administrative, logistical, or psychological friction that is quietly stopping your team's massive latent capability from becoming a permanent lift? Find the friction, isolate the sludge in your own gears, and you might just unlock your ultimate potential. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. Keep questioning the scoreboard, keep examining the hidden structures around you, and keep exploring.